Hello, I'm Alejandro Castillo, Director of the Office for Hispanic Communications for the Archdiocese of Chicago. I'm also the Managing Editor of Chicago Católico, the Archdiocesan Spanish-language newspaper. I will be having a conversation with Jean-Pierre Ruiz today. Jean-Pierre Ruiz is Associate Professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at St. John's University, New York, where he is also a Senior Research Fellow of the Vincentian Center for Church and Society. A renowned Latino theologian and biblical scholar, he is the author of the award-winning book Readings from the Edges, The Bible and People on the Move. The Latino and Latin American faces of Christianity are often misunderstood, misconstrued, or ignored by mainstream U.S. media, as was evident in much of the coverage of the Pope's visits. Our conversation explores the significance of these trips from the perspective of Latino theologian who has provided television and radio commentary on papal travels from John Paul II to Francis. From his view inside the studio, Ruiz looks beyond the Francis effect to explore the critical impact of the Pope's popularity and affectionately calls the first Latino Pope. Thank you very much for being here, Jean-Pierre. It's a pleasure to have you here on the show.
It's wonderful to be here with you.
Wonderful. Let's begin now. How did you get into the papal media coverage business? I understand you've provided insights since John Paul II.
This started a long time ago. It actually started just before Pope John Paul II's first visit to the United States, where I happened to be a student in Rome, and because I was bilingual in Italian and in English, I was invited by L'Osservatore Romano to stop by their offices and listen in on the audio feed, and that's all there was in those days, to listen to whether Pope John Paul II was straying off script during his first visit to the United States. And we had to be very attentive, since Pope John Paul II had been to the United States prior to his election as Pope and was prone to spontaneous statements, so he did frequently enough go off script.
And speaking of going off script, we have Pope Francis now as our current Pope. How has the media changed in the past couple of papal visits to the Americas?
In many, many ways. Of course, the media have become richer and denser and more multimodal. So we have everything from traditional print media, newspapers, and traditional television and radio to social media and Twitter and so forth. And the Holy See has kept abreast of all of these developments, and the Pope has his own Twitter feed, and there is a very, very lively social media presence of the Holy See on all of this. In addition, Pope Francis has, even more than his predecessors, has made himself available to the media in a variety of different venues. So the Pope giving a news conference for 2 hours at 35,000 feet has become a standard operating procedure of papal trips wherever he happened to go, including his most recent travels to Cuba and to Mexico.
For commentary, how do you prepare for these papal trips? As an example, this most recent trip to Cuba and Mexico, how did you prepare for that?
Pope Francis has been remarkably consistent in terms of his message. So there was a great deal of expectation that a lot of what he would say, that a lot of the message that he would deliver to the Church in Mexico would be a message that flowed out of his most recent encyclical Laudato Si on the care of our common home, and emphasizing both dimensions of that very important encyclical, specifically the ecological dimension, but even more specifically the human dimension. He speaks about integral ecology, whereby one cares not only for Mother Nature, for planet Earth as our common home, but that this goes hand in hand with attention to those who are the most marginalized in the throwaway culture of our time, and calling us to a culture of solidarity with the least, solidarity with those who are the most disadvantaged on our planet, who tend to suffer disproportionately more. So, in terms of the consistency of the Pope's message, he was remarkably on spot. He was remarkably on message there, being very attentive to tailor what he had to say to the specific people with whom he was meeting, to the specific audience that was receiving his message, whether those were government authorities or prisoners or hospitalized children or even on the border between the United States and Mexico. A remarkable consistency to his message.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about, you described the media landscape and how fragmented it is. You know, we're not only talking about the traditional print and electronic media, but we're talking about bloggers, we're talking about people who simply tweet out their opinions and so forth. How would you rate the media coverage of this last papal visit? Would you give them an A, B plus, C minus? What grade would you give them in terms of their accuracy?
If I were to be generous about it, I think I would give them a C minus. Mm-hmm. And the image that I want to use for that is the image of Flat Francis. Mm-hmm. Because throughout the Pope's visit to the United States, when he visited us in 2015, one of the most popular images was this two-dimensional cutout of Pope Francis, mm-hmm. who was used in a variety of different settings to express solidarity with the Pope, to express unity with the Pope, just to take pictures with mm-hmm. an image of the Pope. The problem with the Flat Francis is that the Flat Francis can be taken wherever you want to take it, and it's two-dimensional mm-hmm. rather than three-dimensional, and Pope Francis's message, by and large, could not simply be reduced to the two-dimensional sound bites to which it was being reduced by quite a lot of the media, who didn't quite get the depth, who didn't quite get the breadth, who were using what Pope Francis was saying to reinforce stereotypes about the Latino and Latina communities in the United States, and to generally get things fairly wrong.
Hmm. Now, how would you, we talked a little earlier about, off camera, in terms of correcting some of the media misstatements, perhaps. How do you think that they react to that correction?
It's been my experience that the best journalists, the best news people are very welcoming of and very receptive to these sorts of corrections. So, for example, during the coverage of Pope Francis's impending meeting with Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill during the Pope's stopover in Havana, a number of media outlets reported, and this made front-page news in all sorts of traditional media outlets, the first time that the Pope has encountered a Russian Orthodox Patriarch in 1,000 years. Well, people simply repeated that without being critical about it, without really going into depth in terms of the study of the history of Catholic Orthodox relations, neglecting the fact that it was in 1964 that Pope Paul VI had the groundbreaking meeting with Patriarch Athenagoras, and that more recently Pope Francis has met on a number of occasions with the ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, to the extent that the two of them journeyed together as pilgrims to Jerusalem. So the state of Catholic Orthodox relations has advanced considerably in the last 50 years. A lot of that was eclipsed by the sensation that for the first time the Pope would meet with the Russian Orthodox Patriarch. Now, yes, this was a vitally important meeting because Patriarch Kirill is a spiritual leader of the largest of the Orthodox churches, and because there had been some considerable tensions between the Roman Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, particularly in the wake of the 1990s, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the recovery of the Russian Orthodox Church of its important place in the history and in the spiritual life of the people of Russia. So no doubt this was an important meeting, but it needed to be nuanced against the background of half a century of growing ecumenical respect between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches that began with Pope Paul VI.
Jean-Pierre, just to be fair to many of the media outlets, you know, we've boiled down people's essences to 15-second sound bites. So how do you think that they can convey such deep, profound historical context within a matter of a story that takes maybe a minute and a half to tell?
What's wonderful about our Catholic tradition is that we're a sacramental people. So sometimes we don't say things with words, we say things with images. And images in the rich media environment in which we find ourselves are very, very important communicators of the message. For example, When Pope Francis was in Michoacan celebrating Mass during his most recent visit, he did something that would have seemed unusual to a lot of people. He carried a bishop's crozier. Now, a pope ordinarily doesn't carry a crozier. Instead, he carries a cross. And in fact, when the Pope visited with prisoners in Mexico, they presented him with a hand-carved crucifix that he used during that portion of the trip. But when the Pope was in Michoacan, he carried an ordinary bishop's crozier. Well, with a little bit of research, it was possible to learn that this crozier was very important symbolically, in that it had been carried by Vasco de Quiroga, who was the first bishop of Michoacan, who was known for the importance of his outreach to and his sensitivity to the indigenous population of that region, which was something that Pope Francis wanted to foreground during this trip to Mexico. So without saying a word, by carrying the crozier that had belonged to the first bishop of the place, by using for the celebration of Mass the chalice that had belonged to the bishop of the place, he was sending a message that is very, very easily captured in the rich medium of television, with a little bit of background research on what these important symbolic gestures mean. Likewise, when Pope Francis was celebrating Mass with indigenous communities, he reverenced the altar not alone, but together with two women who were holding ceramic censers, and the incense was used was not the traditional incense that's used in the Roman Catholic liturgy. It was the copal that has been traditionally used in indigenous worship. I don't think anybody picked up on that. And with my friends in social media, we were Facebooking and tweeting back and forth about how important it was not only that these ceramic censers were used, not only that copal was used, but that together with the Bishop of Rome, two women who happened to be wives of permanent deacons were reverencing the altar with the aromas of the incense.
But that's why we have people like yourself, Jean-Pierre, to point those little details out. And I'm sure that those details were done and celebrated, and those actions by Pope Francis were intentional, of course. Let's talk about the Francis effect. Do you think, or what do you think is the Francis effect in this last visit? Will it have a profound effect on society? Will it meet the goals of the papal trip?
Throughout his ministry as Bishop of Rome, this is a pope who has emphasized again and again and again the importance of a culture of dialogue. And the importance of a culture of dialogue is something that should not be lost in a world where conflict ordinarily takes first place and dialogue takes a distant second. So this is a pope who has been willing to meet with people who disagree with him in fundamental ways, granting long interviews to atheists, speaking with anybody who wants to speak to him, down to telling the Russian Orthodox Patriarch that he was willing to meet with him anytime, anywhere. That anytime, anywhere happened to be Cuba during this most recent visit. I think that too many people dismiss Pope Francis in terms of his style as someone who is the humble pope or who is the pastoral pope, and compare him to his predecessor, Pope Benedict, who's understood as the scholar pope, the university professor pope, failing to grasp that this is not just pastoral style, but at the heart of what Pope Francis is saying is some very, very profound theology, that he may be using simple, straightforward words that people can understand when he's addressing them, but these come from the heart of a very sophisticated understanding of what the Church is, the role of the Bishop of Rome, and the mission and the vision to which he's calling the Church in the 21st century, to overcome a culture of indifference, to overcome a throwaway culture, and to embrace a culture of solidarity. There's theological weight behind that, and it would be a misunderstanding to reduce it to a matter of simple politics.
Speaking of politics, we're in the middle of an election year. Immigration is a hot topic. A political candidate, talked about, Pope Francis's shouldn't have any business talking about immigration because he has no context, no understanding of it. Do you think that the Pope's message to the world was lost because of that, or hijacked because of these politicians, or do you think it actually got through because of it?
I'm hoping that it's going to get through because of it. Pope Francis has been very attentive to being above partisan politics, but as he admitted during the press conference during which he was asked specifically about the issue of border walls versus bridges, he shrugged his shoulders and said that, well, Aristotle says that human beings are political by our very nature. So to be a social being, to be a human being, is to be involved in the organization of society. He does this pastorally in his function as Bishop of Rome and as pastor of the Universal Church. He's been on point with this. He's been on message about the issue of migration, about asylum seekers, about refugees, not only in the Americas, but throughout the world. He's conscious that there is a global crisis around people on the move, and that it is symptomatic of the throwaway culture, the culture of indifference that characterizes so many people and so many places. It's to be hoped that people of goodwill, no matter what their religious affiliation may be, will be attentive to this call for a culture of solidarity. Yes, people are going to try to hijack the Pope's message, but that's not his concern. People will say about him what they're going to say about him and reduce the very three-dimensional Pope Francis to flat Francis whenever it suits them, trying to enlist his positions as ammunition for their culture wars or for their own ideologies. But he's tried very, very clearly to distance himself from ideological politics and from partisan politics, and to stick to a very simple message, the message of a certain Jesus of Nazareth, who took sides with the least ones.
The papal flight to and from his papal visits seemed to be part of a growing phenomenon for the media, because he tends to entertain questions, no holds bar. Any question, he'll take a crack at answering them. I kind of liken it to interviewing Michael Jordan in the locker room after a big game. What was your sense of the papal plane ride home with the media and how that went?
Unfortunately, it's been reduced to the one issue vis-a-vis electoral politics in the United States. It was actually a very broad-ranging interview that ranged from discussion of how to respond to the Zika virus, even to discussion of the possibility of a papal trip to China. And again, the Pope is entirely open. The culture of dialogue extends to those journalists who are flying with him wherever he happens to be. And as he goes to the back of the plane, he has no idea what sorts of questions he's going to be facing, and he answers them as candidly as possible. Sometimes I'm sure Father Lombardi is a little bit concerned about what he's going to have to clean up afterwards, but that's his job, and sure, it's up to the Pope to speak as he sees fit to encourage a positive relationship with the media. He's reached out for in-depth interviews, and he feels these impromptu questions at 35,000 feet between wherever he's going and wherever he's been.
How do you think the Pope's messages impacted Latinos here in the United States?
I think that we're hearing, finally, a Pope who comes from where we are. So there's a sense of orgullo, there's a sense of pride, there's a sense of recognition. At last, someone who gets it. At last, someone who tells the story on the basis of more than 500 years of Christianity in these Americas. And it does quite a lot to reverse a story about Christianity and about Catholic Christianity in the Americas, and particularly in North America, to reverse and to correct a story that has been misunderstood as a story of Northern European immigrant Catholicism arriving in the 19th and the 20th centuries. Catholicism has been within the borders of what is now the United States for many, many more centuries than the 13 original colonies. So we talk about the missions in California, we talk about the Catholic presence in Florida, we talk about the Catholic presence along the Gulf of Mexico, which was brought as a result of that complex and non-innocent story of the Spanish colonization of the Americas. And at last we have a Pope who, himself the son of immigrants, recognizes the complexity of the immigrant experience and the long history of Catholic Christianity in the American continents. It's about time.
It's about time. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we wrap up our very first program here?
I'm hoping Pope Francis comes back.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping he continues to be heard more than just the sound bites. You know, those of us who were doing social media during the trip jokingly talked about Paco bites. In other words, particularly memorable expressions from what the Pope was saying, from his discourses, and sometimes from what he would simply say off the cuff, which were things that the traditional media simply wasn't catching. But the richness and the density of the message that he brought is something that we need to hear.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jean-Pierre, for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
It's been a pleasure.